Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Wayne Public Library Virtual Jazz Series. And today I have the great pleasure of chatting with guitarist David O'Rourke. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Patty. I've enjoyed watching other interviews that you've done, so I'm honored to be participating on the other end now.
Thank you. I had the great pleasure of meeting you, I realized, in 2022 in New Jersey at the Raymonsburg Historical Homestead. It was a great concert with Martin Pizzarelli and Carl Latham. And then there were two other concerts with the New Jersey Jazz Society that I saw you perform. And then most recently, you were part of the Don Braden Ensemble, which was part of our Wayne Public Library concert jazz series that we have in collaboration with Our Lady of Consolation Church, and that was in March. And boy, what a great concert that was!
So much fun. It was, yeah. Don picks great music and great people to play it. He might have had a lapse in judgment when it came to the guitar chair, but uh, no, actually, I should mention something about that concert, which kind of speaks to how musicians sometimes advocate for each other and all. First of all, there wasn't a musician in that band that I wouldn't feel honored in on any day of the week to share the stage with. But many of them had been playing Don's music for many years, and Don's preparation is meticulous. He sent charts way in advance, pretty, compared to sometimes you get slammed by people the night before a gig and you're going to be teaching all the next day. And when am I going to get to look at this? He did everything right. And they were beautifully, I actually wrote to him after the fact, after the performance, about how beautifully organized his charts are as somebody who arranges for full orchestra a lot. And the vital information was all there. However, I was in one of the busiest phases of my life and I couldn't get to, I told them about a week out. I'm not sure I'm going to get to all of this. And I basically said to him, if you want to put somebody else in who'll serve your music with the kind of level of let's say commitment that it deserves, I could not be mad at you because I know I'm not going to get the preparation I would like to put in. And he dismissed that and said, do what you can. And when I got to the sound check, of course, I'm coming from another gig. The one who needs the sound check rehearsal more than anybody, I'm the one that's going to arrive late. And Oscar was there, who I played with once before, Oscar Perez. And I just leaned into him and I said to him, whatever tune you're on, you're going to have to do the heavy lifting here. I was starting into my disclaimer speech to not, and he, this is the thing. You've no idea how this can shift the paradigm shift. If you like, he just looked up at me, smiled while he's reading through a chart and said, I got you. And you know what's interesting is he can tell when I was getting comfortable with certain things and would back off and let me play. So I just wanted to publicly address something like that because that's the kind of thing that inspires me a lot, the way musicians, because I do it for other people in similar circumstances. And it just made it such a joyful gig with all that great music that Don brought.
So for those who are watching this concert is recorded and it's on our YouTube page. I'll put a notation at the end of this interview so that you can go find it and see how wonderful David is on it.
Just the camaraderie that exists. I remember Andy McKee from Bradley's days, and I'd never played with him before that day. So I was already a big admirer of his work going back decades. It's a great excitement factor, even, I'm 65 now, and, it doesn't get any less exciting when you get to play with great musicians you've listened to for years. But then on the other end of things is Alvester Garnett. I don't think he ever, if he, I don't think he ever plays a gig where he doesn't elevate the performance from everybody. He's a very specially gifted musician. Like I've been blessed actually to play with some of the greatest drummers. Sometimes only one gig. There's uh, Oh gosh, Billy Higgins I played one gig with, and it's imprinted in my brain the sound of the ride cymbal. I'm spoilt by my friendship with Lewis Nash and get to work a lot with him. And to me, the drums, when they hit that ride cymbal, just certain drummers have a sound uh, on it, and Alvester's one of those people. He touches the drums and it's like a symphony.
Let's
Thank
talk
you.
a little
Yeah.
bit about your earlier time in Ireland. Who introduced, I know you're from a musical family, but who introduced you to the guitar specifically, and did you play any other instruments growing up?
Um, so who introduced me to the guitar was my late brother Michael. He died a couple of years ago, and my first instrument was, I have to be 100% honest, I was picking out a melody with one finger on the piano. We had a baby grand piano in our house. We'd no money, but we had a great piano and we had a great sound system. We, you know, we circumstances when I was growing up was my dad was an alcoholic who sobered up when I was 7. So I'm just mentioning that because I witnessed not only somebody rebuilding our lives, my mother as well, and him, but a significant part of my childhood growing up was watching them help others. Maybe not long after he had just, gotten himself together. But I had 3 older brothers who it's kind of, I often think about this, that we had the same parents, but we had different parents. My older brothers were dealing with different challenges that I never faced. Um, and I often hear people talking about their childhood and, you know, uh, my music and musical tastes come from everyone in my family, I realize. And I often wonder what would have happened if I was the oldest sibling? Because I'm drawing from, I could define different genres that to this day are an important part of me musically and identify them as coming directly from, my brother Paul was the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys, and I think the Kinks. He was the oldest, is the oldest. My brother Michael, a year younger than him, which it's kind of interesting. I never remember them fighting ever. They busted each other's chops over. Michael was a Beatles guy, so the Beatles versus the Stones argument was going on uh, a lot, and Michael, the one thing they agreed upon was, I suppose, there was a couple of the Stones albums where they were. I remember one was "Get Your Ya-Ya's Out." I think it was a live album from Madison Square Garden, and my brother Michael was playing one day with a slide guitar. I was about 8 or 9, and he's playing Love in Vain by Robert Johnson. And it's so funny how you don't know how this is going to come back into your life in later on in life, but explained, I'm looking at him sliding this piece of glass or metal, I can't remember what, on the guitar, getting this effect. And he told me the story about the crossroads and all that kind of stuff. And it remained in there. My dad had played classical piano until he took it up quite late, as 18, I think he was. And but from the moment he took it up, he was my dad was an upholsterer, and he would come home and practice during his lunchtime, and then go back to work because he obviously worked nearby. And then late at night, he'd be practicing, and they'd have musical soirees. Him with his 2 friends that played piano in Moore Street in Dublin, which is, if you can imagine, it's considered the center of old Dublin, where it's a fruit and vegetable market, and the accents are spectacular. If they're selling, if 3 pennies for uh, they say tomatoes there, you'd hear them say threepence the tomatoes. You'd nearly need an interpreter, but the windows would be open in the apartment or the flat in Moore Street, and some of the it's so funny to me to hear the dealers saying to my mother's last maiden name was McAvoy, say Brenda Mac, God, there's lovely music coming at night from your. And it was my dad and his friends playing, but I think the advancement of his alcoholism moved him away from music. So I grew up only hearing him play a couple of snippets, which to this day, there's one Chopin waltz that he would only play an opening part of it. And his interpretation beats the hell out of anybody I've ever heard, be it Daniel Barenboim. I'm locked into this beautiful rubato that my dad was playing and wishing I could hear more. But my older brother Michael telling me that he used to sit underneath the piano as a baby grand while my dad practiced, and he would sit there for hours, or it seemed like hours probably to a young boy at the time. And I used to envy that I never got to hear him. Not till years later, we were in Jazz Standard, and he plays a piece of Claire de Lune, and he looked at me with a smile on his face, just so you know, I'm not a one-hit wonder. So he's playing on the piano in Jazz Standard during the day. But I started on piano. I know that's your initial question. And when my mom asked me if I'd like to take lessons, I honestly thought, hand on my heart, that I just showed up at somebody's house for a lesson. They'd show me how to do it once a week, and that'd be it. None of this practice stuff was involved. And that became an issue when I had to miss a soccer game with friends of mine. Um, I was heading out. My mother said, "Have you practiced yet? I haven't heard you practice." And I go, I can't now because I got to. And she said, "No, you can't go to the game." And I said, "I can't practice. I lost my music." And she lifts the lid on the piano from where I'd hidden it. So it was a bit of a bumpy start from the idea of I, my prayers appeared to be answered when the teacher stopped teaching. Her mother had passed away and she wasn't teaching in the area. And I thought, yes, I can stop. But meanwhile, I was starting to hear a lot of music and begin, I was picking up stuff by ear. And my dad, not meaning intentionally to encourage me at the time, but I remember somebody saying, "Your son seems to have a really good ear for music." They could hear me playing songs that were on the radio and picking up stuff. And my father rolled his eyes and said, "Oh, don't talk to me about it. We tried getting him lessons. He wouldn't practice, but he has an incredible ear." And all I heard was incredible ear, and I believed him at the time. And uh, I think that, honestly, Paddy, that has shaped how I deal with students to this day. If you give somebody an encouraging word when teaching, it could be the key in the ignition for them, and because I used to go back to that for years, that I believed until jazz challenged, and it will challenge anybody's ears because you're now dealing with a whole different level. But I always felt that was my strong point because my dad told me so when I was 14 or something like that.
I found a wonderful article from Jazz Guitar Life where you're writing about your five desert island album picks, and you bring up a memory you have with your father of where you wrote, I remember the day my dad said we were going to town into Dublin City to buy an album, and then sitting together listening to it, shaking our heads at the absolute mastery of one of our own. And you were referring to Louis Stewart. And it's such a wonderful memory that you have that you share with your dad, and I'm sure you're probably your brothers as well. And I have similar memories too with my family doing exactly the same thing. So that really stood out to me. It is a wonderful memory to not only appreciate music on your own, but it's more special when you're sharing it with someone. So let's talk a little bit about Louis Stewart.
So I put him in a very special category, that the unanswered question. There's nobody can explain why Louisville, Kentucky produced Muhammad Ali. Um, there's no history of great boxing champions that moved like that coming out of there. Soccer player George Best in Northern Ireland, Belfast, one of the greats of all time. And there's no, again, just dribbling a ball home after school. But there's no Louis Stewart to play world-class jazz guitar, um, coming from Dublin, Ireland, there were musicians there, but not at that world-class level, with the exception of Noel Keelan, pianist and arranger. who was over here for a little bit as well, in the 60s, I believe. But Louis, I can explain away any progress I've made through the years because he set the bar so high by just, he sounded like an American musician. And nowadays, we live in the global scenario where there are great players all over the world. But in those days, somebody coming up in his case, the late 60s, he won the Best Soloist Award at the Montreux Jazz Festival and got to play with Clark Terry's big band, which must have been a tremendous thrill for him at the time. There's a recording exists from the festival actually, and Louis playing with one of his idols, Kenny Burrell, and Bill Evans listening to him. And somebody told me they remember sitting beside Louis listening to Bill Evans, and they looked over. Bill had played something, and he was about to say, "Did you hear that?" And he looked over, and there was a tear coming down Louis's face. Um, so that's who I had to. It was great for it. It's one of the reasons I think why Dublin and Ireland has a high level of jazz guitar because he set the bar so darn high that just to be taken remotely seriously required that you be at your best. And I eventually got to play with him quite a bit. I never studied with him because I was unfortunately too late. He'd stopped teaching. He wasn't a fan of teaching because he was self-taught largely. And he he had, there were a few people who thought there was one guy called Alan Grundy who studied with him for a while, and he showed me his notes from Louis, which were definitely hugely helpful for me to get going. But what I did do was I was hoping that his gift would be contagious, so I would try and put myself in close enough a distance to catch any disease that would make me sound that good. And in doing that, what I did was nowadays, they would call this stalking and probably call the police. I just showed up at his house uninvited and was never turned away until eventually my dad said one Saturday afternoon, I'm getting ready, two buses to go across to Walkinstown where Louis was living. And my dad said, "Are you going out to Stewart's again?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Do you not think, his kids might want to spend some time with their daddy without somebody else there?" And there's no argument with that. I suddenly go, "Oh God!" Now I'm sitting twiddling my thumbs watching a show called Match of the Day, you know. And a phone call goes. My mother said, "There's Betty Stewart on the phone, Louis's wife. Where are you?" The kids are wondering, "Are you coming out?" And that meant the world to me because I didn't have younger siblings. And all of a sudden, I thought that, they saw me as part of the family. So what Louis would do with me, and it was very frustrating for somebody at the time who just show me so I can do it. I show me now, you know. What he did was he played recordings for me of his favorite artists, favorite guitar players, a favorite solo, and he would say, "I love the way the guy builds this solo." And now I'm listening for what does he mean? And and then he would say, "I love how Cedar Walton comps here or Bill Evans comps here." And so now I'm listening to the comping. And I look back now and I realize he was teaching me how to listen, and things to listen for. You can sit back and listen for recreation, which for me happens mostly in my car. Um, because like a lot of working musicians, our listening often is dictated by a project that we have coming up. We have to learn music for it, and you know, and and maybe with family life, you don't have, you're not sitting down like we did, and I'm imagining the days you with your dad and that experience you had. People listen socially. You'd have three or four people, sometimes friends over listening to an album, and then one has to get up to change the side of the vinyl. So Louis, I believe, while at the time I wished he would go here, this is how you do it here, as he used to say, describe people like I was at the time, looking for the keys to the kingdom. And what he taught me was how to teach myself, I believe.
That's a valuable lesson right there. When you're teaching students now, though, do you find it's such a different time than when you and I grew up that we had less demands on us, especially electronically? Do you find that it's harder for students now to find that time to just carve out space to listen and feel it and to ingest it than when we were growing up?
Yeah, I'm trying to, it's a constant kind of survey for me, a personal survey I'm carrying out. With me, I would put on recordings, and I remember my mom watching TV, and we are all in the one room, and I had headphones on, which were kind of a new thing in the 70s for us in the uh, you know, and I'm listening to Wes Montgomery and falling half asleep because we were and dreaming. I remember one time half dreamland, thinking I was at the half note when I was listening to Smoking at the Half Note, and I remember it was a portrait of Jenny, the ballad, and drifting off, and then there was a version of Misty with Wynton Kelly playing and those dramatic chords at the end and being woken by the sound of the applause. And for a minute thinking I could see Wes and because I'd been looking at the album cover before. So the relationship with listening is on one side it looks like I might be saying that they're not with the distractions, they're not certainly not doing it like I did because I didn't have those distractions. But on the good side, I think you're finding a lot of examples of, um, young musicians suddenly emerging, and this kid sounds like he's been listening to Lester Young. And I'll go, where, do you have a parent that plays? And no, where did you hear this? YouTube. So they're finding the music themselves, and they hear something. Oh, I like this, and so I think in that particular way, their listening has been it's not being dictated by like I felt we reached a situation where the record companies were controlling what they were telling us what was good and what we should be listening to, even in a small microcosm of the music business that the jazz world is. There was the major labels were dictating uh, for a brief period there, and I think YouTube and all the streaming services, which I have an issue with them because they've taken away livelihood from musicians. The idea that you have to have 100,000 plays to get $1 or something like that, whatever it is. Uh, just the person that's getting ripped off is the person who needs it most, and that's why you see so many artists touring and that kind of thing. But I do feel that kids are able to find, if they're inquisitive, they're able to kind of shape their own path and what they want to learn.
That's a good point. But boy, I think you and I were very lucky to grow up at a time where we put those headphones on, or if we had a record player in our room, and just being able to isolate and listen and feel it. It's a unique experience, I think.
Well, I'd mentioned earlier on about my brothers and the influence they would have had on my listening. And you go to my next brother up from me, Andrew, was the folk guy. So I was hearing Bob Dylan, Donovan, but he was also big into traditional Irish music, which was enjoying a revolution of being influenced by American folk at the time. It's kind of it was two-way influences happening. And Planxty was a band and the Bothy band, and Horslips who were kind of bringing rock to Irish music. And then we were all aware of Rory Gallagher. I never really studied his playing because I think I'd gotten into jazz, but he was so respected by blues musicians um, there. But that was my brothers, but my dad was the one who sat me down and played. I remember in one listening session, I'd hear a movement of a Mozart piano concerto, followed by Mahalia Jackson singing a spiritual, followed by Errol Garner's Concert by the Sea, Miles Davis. Um, and then all of a sudden he's playing, what's this that hymn that he puts on? I wouldn't remember all, but I was introduced to so many different kinds of music, and the concept of genre was alien to me. It was all music, you know. But he did take the trouble to tell me regarding jazz that what an upholsterer who played classical pianos interpretation of jazz improvisation and how they were, he's trying to explain how they were making up melodies and composing on the spot, I suppose. And then that would lead to, with the spirituals and that, my dad gave me, kind of a history lesson on what had happened to black people in this country. And, there's like, I remember, for example, the scene in the James Bond movie that's set in New Orleans, The Spy Who Loved Me, and they're doing Just a Closer Walk with Thee, and me asking my dad, did they not like the guy who died? They all seem so happy. And my dad said, son, my dad was agnostic, by the way, in Catholic Ireland. He said, son, there's some cultures where they think that, when you're dying, you're going on to something greater, and they feel the need to celebrate the person's life rather than, and it never, these little conversations never left me. So when I hear spirituals, I'm still connected to those. I've been asked, I won't say any more about it for now, but I've been asked about doing a project with orchestra uh, with Mahalia Jackson's music, and straight away I'm almost looking up, going, "Are you hearing this, Dad?" You know, I was listening, I promise.
Now, in 1982 is when you came to the United States and broke into the jazz scene. What was it about that year, that time, that allowed that opportunity to come about?
Kind of that's a very interesting set of circumstances because I had participated in, they had a classical music competition called the Young Musician of the Future, and I made the finals because I won the jazz section. And for me and a lot of the contestants that I was up against, some of them were classical musicians who wanted just the chance to try something different. So they entered the competition because they knew they'd get to play with Noel Keelan, who was very respected in Ireland. And that was also a factor for me too. I was really excited and nervous about playing with him. And I remember playing J.J. Johnson's Lament in one of the heats, and it was live on radio. And when they take a break, uh, Noel's response to me when he was supposed to give a critique, he was laughing. He says, "We got any gigs for me, Dave?" So he was giving me the endorsement like that. But um, I ended up getting a certain amount of publicity over being the first non-classical musician to make the finals. And one day, a lady approached my dad she was working pretty high up in PR in Aer Lingus, offering me free travel to go take lessons. They were suggesting London because they'd another musician was going. And the interesting thing was I wasn't allowed to talk about it. They weren't doing it for publicity. They said we're a public company, and now and again we like to put something back via the arts and not for any other purpose other than to put something back. So I was asked not to tell anyone at the time because they would be inundated with applications. And of course, me being me, I didn't know. I'd gone over to London and I didn't feel, I remember thinking, this feels very closed. I'm not going to get in here at all. How am I going to? I'm going to walk up and say, could I sit in? And they're going to say no. And I just didn't feel. I came home with my tail between my legs and saying, I got to come up with something else. And when this offer was made, most people would say, sure, because free flight to London every month to take a lesson. I said, what about New York? And uh, they paused and go, well, let me go back to my boss because in those days they were premium tickets flying transatlantic. And so they came back and they okayed it. I ended up getting 4 flights, I think, back and forth over the years. But that was my first trip, and I stayed with relatives in the Jersey Shore. And on the first night in New York City, by this stage, I'd called a few numbers that Louis Stewart had given me, and one being Bucky Pizzarelli. And he invited me to come by the Pierre and told me to bring my guitar. And now I'm quaking in my boots that I'm going to play in New York City. You got to understand when you're from another country, this is, New York was the mecca of jazz to us. And I remember we were staying in the St. Regis Hotel, and there was a piano player there called Tommy Furtado playing cocktail piano. I sat in with him, and Kathleen Landis, who was another pianist I sat in with. Uh, I think my cousin was dropping major tips on people, but now I go to the Pierre by myself. They didn't come with me, and I remember getting there, and Bucky didn't give me time to get nervous or anything. He just said, "What you take it out? What do you want to play?" And I remember calling Days of Wine and Roses because somebody told me have a song ready to go so you don't fumble, I, and we played it, and I remember taking one chorus of a solo. Now, when you're younger, a lot of the times you want to play 25 choruses, and you're not really interested in what anyone else is playing. That may be a bit harsh, but um, I actually remember thinking, okay, I'm really enjoying this solo, but can you hurry up so I can play mine? You'd be in that mindset, whereas you get older and now you'd prefer to comp behind somebody else's solo sometimes than play your own because it's so much more fun, the conversation. But thankfully, on that occasion, uh, I, I got out of Dodge after one chorus, and Bucky leans over and goes, "Take another one." And that was like gold to me. I took another chorus and then we played in a mellow tone. I remember there was a third tune which I can't remember, but Tony Monti was on piano and Jerry Bruno was playing bass. There were no drums. And I just remember thinking, this is amazing. I just couldn't believe it. And that same day, or the next day, sorry, I was brought to Les Paul's house and by Wayne Wright. So all the numbers that Louis Stewart had given me were starting to get back to me when I was in New York, and I'm on a payphone. Did anyone call? And oh, thank God you called. You need to get up to the China song. Uh, was the restaurant where all the musicians hung in those days. You got to get up to the China song by noon. Where are you? And I remember saying I'm on 41st and 8th, and they go, that was a really bad area in those days. And they were going, oh, that's not great. You got to get out of there, but you're not too far. You can make it. And next thing I'm in Les Paul's house, and I just, the effect on me, I met Woody Shaw that night in the Village Vanguard I had an album with me. Martin Taylor got me into the Vanguard on Stefan Grappelli's comp ticket. He was in town with Stefan Grappelli and he told me Woody Shaw had been in to hear Jim Hall the night before. Maybe he'll be in again. And I'm thinking, and all of a sudden he goes, he's here, go up, get him to sign it. And I wasn't an autograph guy really, but now I've got Woody Shaw's arm around me, introducing me to everybody. And to me, getting welcomed to New York by Woody Shaw, he wrote his phone number on the album cover and said he'd come pick me up to take me. I asked him, was he playing anywhere? Because I worshipped him. I thought he was the next level Miles Davis, where you played in his band like people did in Blakey's band and your career was set. Mulgrew Miller was with him, and I was so starstruck, and I'm going, "You're the man!" The minute, and he's hugging me every time, every nice thing I'm saying to him. He goes, "Oh man," and he's saying, "Hey, my friend from Ireland," you know. So how could you not want to move here when your welcoming party is Woody Shaw? And 3 months later, I was back. I came for a month and I came back 3 months later.
And that was it.
Well, I was here for 10 months and my visa ran out and I hated going back. I wanted to stay so bad. And that was 83 and it was in 89 that I finally got the green card to come back. But everything happens for a reason. My parents got ill when I went back and I was there at a crucial time. I was kind of off the scene in Ireland at the time, and some people were not, there were certain things being said about that they didn't understand what was going on, but um, people come first, you know what I mean? And especially my parents, and I was they ended up living a long time after that, but it was, when you're dealing with when you're a kid and you're the youngest and your parents are both having heart related issues, at the same time you're thinking this could be it. And so that was my focus for, a number of years, but they ended up living like that was like 84. I remember my dad had bypass surgery, and I asked the cardiologist or doctor, realistically, what are we looking at? And he said maybe 5 or 6, 7 years. So remember, this is 84 that he had the surgery, I think. My dad passed in 2001. So, and the intervening years, he was over here with me, my mom and dad, and they saw me play with Al Harewood. I think they saw me play with Cedar Walton. They saw me play with, a lot of legends. So it was everything happens for a reason, I guess, is the moral of that story.
Well, I'm a firm believer in the timing of things in one's life, that we may never understand it while we're going through it, but then you can look back in hindsight and realize, okay, I was at the place and the time I needed to be at that specific instance. And I'm also a firm believer that people are brought into our lives at a specific time for a specific reason.
What triggered me now when you just said that was Martin Pizzarelli. I got to know him later in life, only the last few years. And the best way I can describe it is it's a bit, those stories that you see where particularly in Ireland, you hear this, somebody was adopted and there were no records allowed to be shared. And then years later, they're unsealed and people meet, and the instant bond that you feel with somebody. Martin Pizzarelli, it's like that with me. Every time we play together, it's like getting together with your favorite brother. And we're laughing and we have so much fun, and we're making great music together. It feels great. It's just so I just played with him this past Thursday, and I'm playing with him again the end of this month, the 26th, at Felina's. And we're playing tunes, lots of tunes, short solos, and not a whole lot of stretching because we're, the tunes. And I always feel like Bucky and his manager, who helped me out so much, Dick Abels, that Martin and I were talking about this. Martin actually said they're in the frets, you know. It feels like they're near. And, so being in the right time, like to meet Martin at this point, especially when, Bucky has passed on, it's it's very spiritual to me. I feel blessed to have him in my life and wish that we could get to do more together. You know, but just putting that out there, for anyone, we really enjoy our musical company and beyond. But the connection back to what when I first met Martin, I said, "Have you any idea what your father did for me?" Because his dad tried to get me a 6 night a week job in the Pierre Hotel when I went back 3 months later. And at that stage, I didn't have work papers, so that's when I had to say to, Bucky, I walked in and he goes, Dick, take him down the hall. They're looking for a trio 6 nights a week. And he looks at me and he goes, not cold trio, no drums, and I'll get you the guys. And I'm thinking, I can't believe what I'm hearing, but I'm going, Bucky, I can't. And in those days, not only was it the union, but, working, without a work permit, I didn't want to dirty my bib so that I could come back at a later point. And I just said, Bucky, I don't have a green card. And Bucky just goes, talk to Dick Abels. He'll get you any card you want. He thought it was like a union card. He didn't realize it was, immigration status. But what I don't forget is that here I was as an immigrant, and Bucky Pizzarelli was trying to give me the greatest gift of all. There was that much work available. I guess in those days that there was enough to go around. So when I see Martin, obviously I'm transported right back to the kindness of his father. And I kind of feel that bar was set for me to how, with students and stuff like that to encourage others because he encouraged me so much. Yeah.
I had the great pleasure of interviewing Martin, which is also part of this series, as well as his brother John. And Martin performed here at the library in, I believe it was 2022, in August of 2022. And that's also available to watch. It was a great concert. And I, our family
I
was
saw
very
that interview, by the way. That was a great interview. When you know somebody and you're seeing them being interviewed and you go, when was he ever going to tell me that? You, he was sharing a lot of great stories, but it's a great interview. Um,
Thank you. I appreciate that. Our family were very fortunate to grow up in the same town as the Pizzarellis, and my father was acquaintanced with Les Paul from the 50s, as my dad was a jazz trombonist, and also with Bucky, and I would just had the great pleasure in New York to see Bucky perform many times, and the family are the whole Pizzarelli family are incredible people and generous to a fault, open, friendly, never feel rushed. They're very special people, and I feel fortunate to be able to have interacted with them.
I'm very blessed for all the same reasons. It's I met Mary later in life. I met Anne the night I met Bucky at the Pierre, and John was there that night too, or maybe one of the other nights because I went back a few times. Um, but again, another thing is when I moved here, I would have, you're traveling. I think I had a nylon string guitar plus my Gibson L5, a jazz guitar. And Bucky said to me, if you get called for any gigs that need a special guitar, I got all of them. He said, just call me. And it was years go by before I had to play that card, and he would meet me at what turns out to be Ridgewood bus station and hand off a guitar, and I'd get back on the bus I just got off and go back into the city. And he did that twice, and one was with an Epiphone that's in a museum now, I think in a guitar museum. I think it's on display actually at the moment in John Monteleone, the, the
That's a
luthier.
Benedetto, the seven-string Benedetto that's in the Smithsonian, right?
No, there's an Epiphone that he got from Vaughan Monroe. I know about the Benedetto one is in the Smithsonian, that's right. But this one was a guitar that was given to him as part of his wages playing in Vaughan Monroe's band. And I had to play with one tune with half the band were the original Atomic Basie band, led by Frank West, and the other half were old Ellington alumni. And then there was maybe a sprinkling of the young musicians were me, Willie Williams on alto, and I just remember being stunned by who I was sharing the stage with. Don Sickler was producing, and he just said, "Look, it's not going to look right if you have a guitar that has pickups on it, because Freddie Green never played an electric guitar." And Bucky, when I called him, this is like years have gone by, and he said to me, "I have this Epiphone, and it was strung with bronze wound strings, which you wouldn't put on an electric guitar because they won't pick up." And it was strung to be a loud acoustic guitar. And I just remember playing that, and the late Dennis Irwin playing bass. And I remember Dennis, who whenever you'd say, "Hey Dennis, how you doing?" He goes, "Solid." Solid was he looked. Dennis said, "Hey man, when we take the next break, let's go over to the side and play some Freddie Green and walk bass lines to lock in." And now remember, I've come over from Ireland years earlier, and I'm still in that mindset, maybe hovering around imposter syndrome that, you know, uh, I'm not from here, and here I am playing. Dennis played with, he was at that point playing with, he'd played with Scott Hamilton, and then a day later he's with John Schofield. He was running the gamut of styles, and he'd been in Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. I'd seen him in London with, and here I am playing Freddie Green on Bucky's guitar. Bucky hands me the guitar at the bus stop and goes, "Don't fall in love with that guitar."
But you did.
I did. As it was, I knew I had to give it back, but it was that's is that the guitar equivalent of unrequited love?
Well, who knows? A guitar might have loved you as well.
Maybe, but you never told me.
So let's talk a little bit about your time with Pat Martino.
So Pat was my hero from the time I heard him, because at one point with Louis Stewart and big influence on me, I happened to say in a record store one time in Dublin, "Who does Louis think is the guy?" And this, without hesitation, he goes, "Pat Martino." Now Louis loved all the, and the minute I heard him, there was something just it just struck a note with me, and I remember I'd scour every magazine I could get an interview with him in there, and there was a whole mystique around Pat. Um, you'd hear these stories. Turns out what we didn't know at the time was his whole history with his aneurysm and how he forgot how to play. I met him when it was actually through Vic Juris. Like the chain of Vic Juris's first teacher is Eddie Berg, who lived in Parsippany, because he used to play every Tuesday night in the village gate with a harpist called Daphne Hellman, who was part of the Hellman's Mayonnaise family, and her big grand finale was playing Rhapsody in Blue on the harp, and her trio consisted of Eddie Berg and Ron. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking. Bassist. He was a doctor, lived in New Jersey. But they had me sit in, and Eddie Berg tried to connect me with Vic Juris, and we were playing phone tag a lot. And eventually, when I did, Vic was very busy. He was a rising star at the time. And when I did finally get to meet with him, I just said, I envy you studying with Pat Martino. And Patty was just as organic as this. Vic said, "You want to study with Pat? I'll give you his number right now." And I'm going, "Is Pat okay?" Because I Downbeat or somebody had reported him as having passed away and then had to retract it a month later. There was, because he'd had the aneurysm and it was very touch and go. Um, so I called Pat Martino, and I remember at one point thinking I've about $1,000 left and I can afford to pay up to $1,000. I was willing to go back early if I could get one lesson with Pat Martino. And I remember saying to him on the phone, "How much an hour do you charge?" And he goes, "I don't charge," his deep voice, "I don't charge by the hour, I charge by the lesson. It's $25 a lesson." He said at the time, $25, right? And the lesson can be 5 minutes or 5 hours. And I remember going to Philly and I was thinking, if there's a God in heaven, please make me not be the 5 minute guy, you know? So I went, took a lesson with him, and 5 hours later, his mom called him down for dinner. And that lesson changed my life. He had prepared a lot of the way he thinks about things on the instrument, and he had a little booklet long before they published anything by him. He was sharing all these notes with me. I should also mention that, I was terribly starstruck by this is my hero. And I remember kind of staring like this and, I mean, and he had a way of snapping me out of it that um, put me fooled me into thinking I was on the level with him, at the moment but I was so in awe. George Benson, the same, makes people very comfortable. And so my three heroes of living guitar players were Louis Stewart, Pat Martino, and George Benson. And they tell you don't ever meet your heroes. I became friends with mine, and how can I not feel blessed by that?
You wrote a wonderful piece that I want to refer people to go find online. Memories from David O'Rourke, Pat Martino after he passed. It's from November 2021. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece you wrote. And your
I forgot
experiences
where
with
that
him.
was from. Was that for London Jazz News, was it?
I believe so.
Yeah, because Sebastian Scotney, who runs that, um, if he knows I knew somebody that has just passed, he's often asked me for my thoughts on them because I suppose I'm either gifted or plagued with detailed memory. When I do remember something, as Celino Clark's son, Sal Crocker, said one time, because I noticed he's a similar thing going on, and he looked at me and says, "We remember in 3D," and that kind of made sense to me.
What I like about what you talk about with in this piece of your memories with Pat Martino is your working on a collaboration with him. And it's one of the kind of what we were talking about before, that you're put into a situation, I believe, in our lives at a time and a place. And sometimes if you just put out that idea, sometimes it comes to fruition. And it sounds like that's what happened with Pat Martino, where there was a piece that a classical one, and he wanted to work with you, and you wanted to work with him, and you were able to make time to work on something. You want to talk a little bit about that project?
Yeah, and the lead up to it actually was, I remember Seth Abramson, who booked the Jazz Standard, who's one of my closest friends here, called me to. He said, "I don't know if you're planning to catch Pat this week, but he's playing this tune by Mingus, uh, and it was a dedication to Duke Ellington, a beautiful ballad. I'm just blanking on the exact title of it, but I can." And he said, "You got to hear him play this." And we went off on a tangent talking about how, everyone talks about Pat's chops and his long lines, but it's his ballads, his the beauty of his ballad playing is. And so we go in, and at the end of the gig, Seth and I are talking to Pat, and uh, Pat said something like, sometimes I just want to do a whole night or a whole album of ballads only. And Seth, I think, was the one that steered the conversation. I said, did you ever do anything with strings or with orchestra?" And Seth starts to go, points at me, he goes, "David writes great." He starts talking me up, and Pat just there in that moment said, "I want to do it," and he points at me, and I want to do it with him. And I knew I've been guilty over the years of not being too shy and not jumping on an opportunity at the moment. And I knew this was, I said to Pat in that moment, "If that's something serious that you want to do, I'm in. What's the next step?" And he smiled and he goes, "I'm going out on the road. I'm back on so and so date. Give me a day or two to recuperate and call me then." I called him. We arranged the first meeting. Now, you got to imagine the mindset. I'm going to his house now. Do I bring something? Or if I bring something that I've written for him, is he going to feel like I'm pushing him in a certain direction? Uh, so I really didn't know what to do. So I kind of went into the middle ground. I wrote 16 bars of "You Don't Know What Love Is," and I wrote kind of a very big band heavy with some strings on it was brass heavy on "The Great Stream," Pat's tune, and I had one chord wrong on it, which he corrected right away with those. I know it's his own composition, but magnificent ears that I had used. There's a similar mistake in the real book, I think. For any of the musicians out there, I had a 7 sharp 9, which Pat loved as a chord, in the one place where there was a 7 flat 9. And, uh, but I just remember at the time saying to Pat, he said, "How's this going to work?" And I go, "Okay." I was honest with him. I didn't know whether I should suggest or he should suggest. So I said to him, "Here's what I'm thinking. You're plagued with people who want to hear you play standards again." And I said, "They're loyal fans who I came up listening to that, but you also did his album Joyous Lake, the original Joyous Lake from the 70s, I think is way before its time. And I had this idea that synthesized music, they were often imitating orchestral instruments. So what if we reverse engineered and wrote the synthesis stuff for orchestra?" And so what I said to him was, I recently went to see Paul McCartney, And there was a time when he wouldn't play any Beatles songs except Yesterday in the 70s. And now here he was at Shea Stadium and he's doing a 3 hour concert embracing his entire career. And I said he's doing new songs as well because that's how he keeps himself fresh. And so I said, I thought about what if we did this with you, where we did stuff from different each period. And Pat just leaned back and he went, he smiled, he goes, interesting. And because up to this point he was dealing with many years of people trying to steer him in a certain direction that he didn't want to go in. And he was protected by um, two people really in the main there, Joe D'Onofrio, his manager, and John Mulhern, his another guitarist student of his and lifelong friend. You know, so in fact, there was one moment where John Mulhern said, and he said like this, dude, you got to get him to play. What are you doing the rest of your life? So I told Pat we're starting to get some requests, and I told him Mulhern wants you to do this, and he would agree to do it. So we went from Pat. This is kind of important to me to share this part because it meant a huge amount to me. Initially, there was a feeling that he was worried about being pushed into something and having no control. And it's not a control freak thing, but nobody likes to have no control. And I said to him, the way I'm looking at this, Pat, is you're Frank Sinatra, and I'm hoping to be Nelson Riddle or Robert Farnon or Gordon Jenkins writing these arrangements around you. And you just do what you do, and we're bringing something else. And he said, interesting. So he said, so what have you got? And I had my laptop with me with not even good sounds on it. I was using Sibelius software at the time, playing with QuickTime instruments. Pat hooks my laptop up to his sound system in his room and practice room and studio. And can you imagine this, Paddy? When we played, I've only written 16 bars, and I told him I just did this to see if I'm going the right one. And you don't know what love is. He starts to play it. I'm hearing this magical sound that I've grown up listening to. And as soon as it finishes, he looks up and there's a tear coming down his face, and he goes, "Yeah, man." And I go, "That that's all I need for the rest of my life," you know. So that project never saw the light of day because there was one guy in Berkeley at the time who was trying to make it happen, and then he abandoned it for one reason or another. I don't know. He's since passed away, so I won't say names or anything like that. But he they were going to give Pat an honorary doctorate, and then the concert would be culminating with this orchestral thing. So I regret that we didn't get the finish line and Pat didn't get to experience, he never got to experience playing with real strings like that live. And definitely I have regrets about that. But what I don't regret is that I met with him once a month for over a year, and it was a full day of, I would leave his house on a high. Uh, well, actually, I'd leave the restaurant on a high because we would go out to eat after. The routine, I'd arrive and he would start to show me what he was working on at the present time. That's, I'm in his house maybe 5 minutes and I'm going, wow, would it be inappropriate if I sneaked a recording of this? I never did, but you're thinking, this is magic. He's showing me what he's working on. And then he would look at me, goes, okay, what have you got for me? And at this stage now, it was up to me. I would say, what about this tune? You want to do this one? Yeah, okay, we'll do this one. And then I'd come back a month later with a chart. And he never wanted any, take that out. I don't like this. The only thing he tweaked was sometimes I would have the tempo set a bit faster for oral proofreading, and I'd forget to move it back. And he very politely said, could you do this a little slower? And I go, it's so embarrassing, Pat. I meant to do that at the beginning. Sorry. But that's the only thing. He tweaked tempo. So for me, I got to collaborate, know what it's like to collaborate with a master, an absolute master. For if we're going to the percentages, he's in that tiny less than 1%, like Wayne Shorter or Chick Corea, Duke Ellington, Billy Strayhorn, the ones that are specially gifted.
Have you thought about revisiting the music and that project to possibly do it as a tribute?
It has come up once or twice. We did do one. Me and John Mulhern played "What Are You Doing the Rest of Your Life" at Pat's memorial concert with a backing track generated from. John's a great engineer, so we couldn't. It was set up that we couldn't use a click track. So with a great rhythm section playing with us, it was so funny. Rick Germanson was playing piano, and when we tried it at sound check, I just looked at Rick and I said, "Should we do this?" It's I don't want it to be. We were going wandering out of tempo as we'd get into it, and I was kind of thinking we don't want to do a disservice in a tribute memorial, and Rick said, "No, we're doing this for Pat." He, and Byron Landon was playing drums, and he was so great. And in fact, he pulled off some magic to get us back in a few times. He would adjust the bar length to get us back on the downbeat because some of the stuff was written in a way that you'd be conducting, and there was built-in pauses and stuff in the music. But it has been suggested I should record it, which I would not be comfortable with, just me. But if the guitar community, it's a high budget thing to do because of full orchestra. Some of the tunes were not finished because we didn't have the, but some of them were. Um, but yeah, I actually think it's some of my finest writing because I've learned now through the years that when I'm writing in collaboration with somebody, um, every project sounds different. And it's because of the other person that I'm collaborating with. They're drawing something different out of me. Um, so I hear, maybe it's my love of Pat. I hear it in the work we did together because I don't write the same way with other people. He had me going places that uh, sometimes even if I stop saying, where did that come from? You know?
You touch on something that I find very special about musicians, where you had spoken about as soon as you walk in the door, he's playing for you, and that communication that musicians have. It's not you're not talking words, you're talking music. You're playing, you're sharing, you're showing each other your creativity, and I love watching that. And as an audience member, you see that when you go to a concert. If you're lucky, you see that.
Yeah, well, you saw it in Wayne or in the church. I'm sorry, not in Wayne Public Library because I didn't play the library. You saw it in the church performance when they did it for me. They got me comfortable enough to be able to play and express myself, and that's the generosity of that's that collaborative kind of feeling. With Pat, I just for any Pat Martino fans out there, just say, I'm sure they'll be envious of me for having had this experience, and I'm envious of myself for having had it. As soon as we'd work for a few hours and then we'd plan our next, what do you want me to do next? Okay, I'll start this. And I would bring him bits and pieces of things in the works. They weren't always complete arrangement, but he could hear where it was going. And at one point I said, Pat, are you okay with this? Do you want me to use strings here or woodwind here? And he goes, oh, I'd prefer to leave all that to you. He completely handed it off. And, so we went from being, the fear of not being in control to suddenly he's giving me all the decision making power because he was picking out repertoire and some originals that uh, and different interpretations we were going to do. It was just the juices were flowing, and then we'd work for a few hours and then go downstairs, and he and Aya, his wife, would play for me. And I remember playing traditional Irish music for them on one of Pat's guitars. So to your point there about how we would play for each other, and then I remember sitting there. I had young kids at the time, so I was having that exhaustion from being up early, taking the kids to childcare or whatever before I got there. And I remember sitting back and he was playing some of the meditation music that he was listening to. And I remember waking up to the sound of my own snore on the sofa. I got so relaxed. Then we'd go out to eat. And that was another dimension to the relationship. Right after the thing, we're sitting down and who knows what we talked about. Then it wasn't always music, it was life and I just felt, I remember him driving through Philly and he said, "You see over there used to be a barber shop there." He goes, "My dad used to bring me in there and make me play Moonlight in Vermont for all the older Italian guys in the place." And he said right next to it there was a music store. And this is the bit that got me because there was so much mystique around Pat and where he learned and how it. And Pat said to me, there was a guy working at that store. He showed me the C chord on the guitar, and I just remember thinking, "Wow, this." And then here's the school where me and Charles Ireland went to school, and just the car rides to, because he would drive to the restaurant, then I'd go back. My car was parked. It was 2 hour parking. I never got a ticket. Don't ask me how. Parked on the street in Philly because apparently everyone gets tickets there. I was there for 8 hours sometimes and no ticket. So who knows? But we would leave my car there and then Pat would drive me back and I'd drive home and I wouldn't have any music on. I couldn't listen to music after the day I'd had. There was so much going on in my head from being with him.
One of the things that comes up in my interviews are all the many hats that everybody wears, and I just want to touch on the many, many hats that you wear. You're a jazz guitarist, a musician. You're an educator, a composer, arranger, and conductor. Do you want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier the jazz standard, but talk about also the youth orchestra?
Yeah, that was a lot of my best ideas were not my ideas at all. There was James Polsky, the founder of Jazz Standard. I was playing 6 nights a week in the restaurant upstairs from Jazz Standard, which before it became Blue Smoke, it was called 27 Standard. And I started out playing solo guitar there, and then it built up to when they started to get more people coming in. James said, "I really want to do music up here." So I had a trio except Fridays and Saturdays, it was a quartet with David Lee Jones on alto sax joining us. And Thaddeus Expose was playing bass, and Dave Mason was the drummer from my hometown in Dublin. Um, I remember when I was starting to kind of, I think, maybe now I can break from teaching. So I gave up my teaching job in a keyboard school out in Flushing, New York. And a week later, James Polsky, I said to him, "By the way, I'm done with teaching." And he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, because I was going to ask you to run my education program." So it's like The Godfather 3, just when you think you're out, they're pulling me back in. And this was initially, it was just organizing, we called it the Discovery Program, bringing in busload of kids from various public and private schools to hear jazz in a jazz club with and get a Q&A with a band. Years later, probably trying to give me something that inspired me more, James suggested putting together a youth band. And in those days in New York, there was the All City Jazz Band, which I think was sponsored by McDonald's back in the day. And other than that, there were just the LaGuardia High School band. There wasn't really much for kids. And he suggested putting this youth band together. And I'm telling him out loud, nah, it's, there all any player that's any good is already tied up with this band or that band. And I was putting all these negative responses out about why it wouldn't work. And all of a sudden, while I'm saying it, actually, you know, what about if we were to do something that different, that make it a performance-driven one? Because I was thinking with a sports brain that, if somebody trains all year round and only has two competitive events, they go stale. And I was hearing that the schools had a fall concert and a spring concert, and maybe something else in between. And I thought, what if they had a steady gig and they played all the time? And yeah, we'll rehearse, but the emphasis will be on performance. And I think that's the model that we brought to it that was copied by a few people since, which I'm not trying to lay claim over anyone else's used to it. But the idea of this comes with philosophy of jazz education for me is, you know, when we're kids, I played soccer on the street with no rules or things. You scored by hitting the ball between these two sweaters that you put on the ground, and it was free play. It was like kids having free play. I felt that we needed something similar in music where it's not a classroom and it's not an adult telling you every 10 seconds what you're doing wrong. How about letting them play? And I began to think, like the Formula One race drivers, if a car gets a puncture, they fix the puncture and get them back into the race. So what we were doing was we'd fix something if somebody was playing a pronounced wrong note against the chord all the time. I might say to the kids, "Did you mean to do that?" And sometimes say, "No, I don't know what to do with that chord." I go, "Okay, that I can help you with." But I wouldn't immediately jump in and correct them, just in case they were making a statement, you know. And so we had a different approach, and over the years, we didn't set out with a plan. James just wanted to bring music to young people, uh, and we hit a stride, I guess. Emily Elishevitz started to help me the program, and we began to see that if you could empower kids, there were so many analogous things that began to crop up. It's like you plant seeds of different types on the same day, but they don't all come up together. They come up at different times. So I began to see, there's some kids are developing at a very quick rate. They're hitting it out of the park right away. And then you've got somebody else, maybe not so much steady. Their deep interest hasn't kicked in yet. And then one day, boom, I remember seeing a bass player walking in and he had a whole different attitude. I hadn't seen him for 3 months. He was walking faster into the club. And I knew before he took the instrument out of the case, he was going to sound great. he, he had a purpose my philosophy was let's give them a playground with instruments. And sure, we'll address things that need to be addressed, but I kind of had a mental limit for me that you could address three things, three topics, and no more. Otherwise, you're doing this wrong, and you're doing this wrong. Um, and then when I did some sports coaching later on, somewhere along the way, they were talking about sandwiching, where you tell somebody something good they're doing with a little critique in the middle, and then return to something good on the way out. And I thought, that's very interesting. I don't think I've ever done that. I'm pretty encouraging in music, but I don't think I've ever forced myself to observe what they're doing right. And that changed my approach then too, that have a listen to somebody and listen for things that you like, as well as things that you might need to fix. And I found that, we gave them a lot of freedom. We weren't intervening a whole lot. And after a while, there were kids getting accepted on full scholarship to some of the major conservatories. And the word got out that if you played in this program, the JSYO, as we call it, the Jazz Standard Youth Orchestra, um, there was a chance that you might get a scholarship into a certain college. And we helped them early days of doing their demos for college. We would help them film on the Jazz Standard stage, hoping it would stand out in the video from somebody else in the practice room. Um, so we continue. The club closed down during the pandemic, but we continue to operate right now out of Cafe Ornithology in Brooklyn. And we'll be back in October and the second and fourth Saturdays in October. Second and fourth Saturdays of each month are, we continue to do, have kids feel they're in a safe, happy place to try things and perform.
We're very fortunate now to have more programs, especially in New Jersey here, that are geared towards kids. We have Jazz House Kids in Montclair, and the Patterson Music Project is addressing that as well. And where was this when I was growing up? We didn't have that. And I'm thinking, where were you when I was in grade school and high school? I could have used you as a teacher because I think I was very much in the box and actually terrified of performing. And just remembering at one concert, I had a cymbal crash, a very integral cymbal crash that I hit in a Holst concert, piece, and I hit it the wrong beat. And here I am, how many years later from my high school, and I'm still taught. Like this still is a nightmare to me. So,
No, actually, I didn't think about things that I would talk about with you in advance for the most part, but one thing that cropped into my head, and I thought this is something that maybe I'll address it. In any kind of sport, it's not confined to just the top professionals. Uh, you know, you've kids playing soccer and they're playing, you'll see kids shoot if there's a basketball net, they're playing, and they're not worried about whether they're top. There's some are better than others and all that, but they all feel free. But with something like jazz, I often think it's kind of like boxing. There people are afraid to go in or you're going to get beaten up. Uh, Something that I think one of the things, with dwindling audiences that people keep talking about, I think it's on us to enlist more people to play at all levels, to experience. And I've done a little bit of this, and I was talking about it. Jazz Arts down here in Red Bank, run by Joe Muccioli. He brought up the subject to me where he he wondered about having an adult big band for people who learned an instrument in school, still have it, but haven't practiced in years, but want to find a pathway back. And I thought about it and I thought, that's no different than, some of the guys who work in an office meeting for a 5v5 soccer game on, you know, everyone should be able to enjoy having a go. So recently it was for a blues concert here at Jersey Shore Jazz and Blues Foundation. My daughter sang on it, Chloe, and some of her friends, and a couple of kids that were younger than her. Chloe's just graduated high school, and the parents were playing in the band. And the only rule was on this one, because it was for the kids, no adults got to take a solo. And so there was one guy playing guitar who um, is a guitar collector, never played. He sang in bands when he was, but never played in a band, and he probably thought he never would. And all of a sudden now he's in a band that we randomly called the Navasink Delta Blues Band, and it was, uh, and there were some of the other parents are going, "You need any more backing vocalists? Sure." And I just saw the community of music, and if you take out, if I confined that to professionals alone, we wouldn't have been able to afford all the musicians and say, but it's made me think a little bit about maybe we need a different level of outreach that it's good to get out and play for people in the community, but is there a way that the open jam session thing can go horribly wrong too? It becomes like gunfight at the OK Corral. But if you had a structure slash no structure, right? That the only structure is that we all meet and we maybe play a chart. But who wants to take a solo on this one? You want to try? And the only rule would be no judgment, no laughing at somebody, or you know. So that's something that's on my mind. That it might be the next frontier is how to get people engaged.
I like that idea because I think in our society, maybe the only musical outlet one has as a layperson in older age is maybe like a church choir or something of that nature that you could participate in. But you're right, there's not really so much for as a band. I like this idea. Maybe it'll make me a musician yet.
Well, it's something that's on my mind, and it was the last thing Joe Muccioli said to me when we were kind of teasing on something. And the other day, I went live on Facebook when it was pouring rain. I love storms, and he happened to see it, and he goes, "We're overdue for a coffee afternoon." He has this great coffee machine that's like the bean equivalent of farm to table. It's grinding the beans as it goes in and makes your cappuccino or whatever. It's all been done in the moment, from literally from whole bean to cappuccino, and I end up being high as a kite from caffeine walking out of his house. But that was one of the things he last suggested, and it's the one of all the things I talked about with him that I'd like to explore. You
I
know,
found a wonderful article. Well, it's actually your faculty profile on the Church Street School for Music and Art. And there's a quote here about your working philosophy is, quote, the opportunity to play music allows children to express themselves, which carries over into all aspects of their lives. Teaching students to perform is not necessarily a linear pursuit, but rather an in the moment endeavor where, if need be, issues can be addressed, teachable moments can ensue, lessons can be learned, and self esteem can flourish. And I love that. It's all your view is all encompassing, really, for almost any age.
yeah, I suppose that's after a lifetime of it. I the whole education thing and the battle against imposter syndrome and how you get over that. And there's if you can empower somebody else to avoid, some of those pitfalls, you're saving them time for the ultimate destination is you're not going to care about all that stuff that you're and with me with orchestration, I I remember, for example, reverse engineering Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe for four hands piano to try and see how he bring it back down to how he orchestrated. And somebody said, Ravel published four-hand versions of all. It took me ages to just get this phrase down, but it started my mind into thinking that way. And so um, I discovered after a while that with I had people who've qualified and with master's degrees coming to me for orchestration lessons, and I think what happens is I'm fascinated by other people's approaches, and probably because I was mainly self-taught, it forced me to explore. When you're self-taught, you explore every avenue, and you never come with the mental idea that this is the way to do it. Now, some people who've gone through an education system will come very confidently and say, "This is how you do it," and they're not wrong if it's working for them. But it's for me, I find myself sometimes saying, well, you could this, or you could that, or you could this. Um, what I what I tend to find is, with arranging an orchestration, the deadline plays a role in decisions. When does it have to be ready by? And if I'm writing functional, somebody wants some charts behind the singer for a particular show, and there's no real hidden or deep meaning behind why that song was picked. It's more about an era. I'm probably operating more like a craftsman in that situation. But then you get um, the other day I was on the phone to Cassandra Wilson about a project we're planning for the fall of 2026, actually. And going through different songs. I said to her, "Do you mind if I just mention titles of songs? And what I want you to say is yay, nay, and we put a third category, maybe." And what was so cool about it is because she thinks this way about music too. That's why our conversations probably can go very deep. She started to describe what she could remember if it was a song she wrote, what was going on. And in one case, why we eliminated a song that she wouldn't revisit. Um, it was related to the passing of her father, and it would be probably too painful for the reason she'd included the song in the first place. But I just remember feeling so grateful to her the other day after that she went into this kind of detail because that's the other way of working that I find fascinating. Somebody says, David, could you write an arrangement for me of Stardust? I want you to do your thing. When's it ready? When does it need to be ready for? I don't need it for, I have a concert in September. Okay, now I got so much time. Now I'm asking different questions. Why Stardust? Did you pick it or did well, it was my father's favorite song and I just have this memory of the minute they go there, it's almost like somebody has kicked open several doors for me and I can go in any of those doors. And it's what I'm doing is I used to listen to actors talking on inside the actor studio, and more recently they have these variety magazine roundtables. And a common thing that let's say your cast, Paddy's going to play a character who at 50 years of age discovers that she in her early 20s um, something had happened in life that but that's the movie starts. There's no retro thing. Now you have to what the actors often do is they'll write a private volume one to that to create the character in their head. Apparently it happens quite a lot. They'll write this prequel or sequel or something in between that helps them play that character. And I remember thinking, I'm kind of like that. I write differently. If the song has special meaning to somebody and they share what it is, it triggers it's almost like stepping on a treadmill that's moving very fast. The creative juices will start then for me. And the interesting thing about it is I can step off and leave the treadmill running and get back on. I can go make dinner and go, but if I'm not on that treadmill at least once, I'm trying to get on one. And it's the difference. I know it's the difference between art and craft, and you cannot dismiss the craft part of it because somebody like Nelson Riddle had to write another New Jersey native, right? He was, I think, originally in Oradell or Wyckoff. He went to school in Rumson down here, but Nelson was churning out arrangements. And he was, Rosemary's daughter told me she could hear the pencil going, and Christopher, who just left us in the last year, his son, um, he told me that Nelson would write 4 bars across and then down, and then page over, 4 bars across down. Now, the interesting thing to me about Nelson is, as somebody once said to me, his low bar was higher than most people's high bar. And that's what's fascinating, the quality of, the originality of the intros that he did and you know, endings and interludes. And after a while, you learn that you could tell that he took a little more time over this section. He was in autopilot, but a very high level autopilot here. So that's a big fascination for me is, I find that the collaborative aspect affects how I work.
That's a fascinating assessment of how you compose. It's the first time I've heard that. Um, Thank you for sharing that. And it's no surprise that you included the Frank Sinatra, Nelson Riddle album on your Desert Island Disc selection there of your 5 albums and the Wee Small Hours.
Yeah, there's it's such a beautiful album. I get along without you very well on that is actually it's a funny story on that one. The opening voicing uh, after the intro, because they have this, the intro is so dark, and it's an example of where the intro was to throw people off rather than, you know, you don't want to show people in a movie the main scene in the intro, and then there's nothing left to show in the movie. So Riddle actually mentioned that in his book called Arranged as an example of where he set a mood that was that when the song came in with that voicing, that chord, and you hear Sinatra, I get along, right, just as that chord is played. When I broke down the chord, I realized it's the same notes as Appalachian Spring, the opening, where the notes separate, and it's in the same key. So I contacted Rosemary, who I was in regular contact with at the time, and I said, "Did your dad ever mention Aaron Copland as an influence or an inspiration?" He goes, and she goes, "He never. I don't remember him saying that, but he introduced me to Aaron Copland backstage in Carnegie Hall." So,
That's incredible. You remind me, recently I watched the documentary about John Williams, and his life and his how he composes, and how he was a jazz musician, and how he is able to evoke and bring mood and feeling to all of his compositions, whether they're for film or not for film. But as Spielberg and he have their collaboration, and also just the fact that you can hear the first few bars of almost any of his movie compositions, and know, and if you're right in the scene, you know exactly where you are. Jaws, Schindler's List, Indiana Jones. The list goes on and on. I mean, it's
so
just
different.
incredible.
They're so different. It's very interesting, actually, somebody like John Williams, because he's almost like the last of the Mohicans, because now we have, and I use them too, sample libraries that sound very convincing, but it's come to the point now where when you score a movie, it seems to be that with the exception of the big blockbusters where they're still using full orchestras, but generally speaking, there's a team of people, and the film companies only really want to deal with royalties to one person, so the composer's getting the credit. Meanwhile, he might come along and go, I'm not going to name names, go bum, 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 bum. Okay, do something with that. And it's handed off to a guy who comes up with this genius underneath it. And his name appears as orchestrator, and he gets a fee and probably paid very well, but no royalties or no repeat kind of fee, but the composer is getting a repeat fee. And a lot of the composers are that are good people are finding a way to get their assistants credited so that they get a royalty. But it's a battle for them. But with somebody like John Williams, um, for years I remember thinking, wow, he had such a strong jazz background. I don't hear it in, his symphonic background. Yeah, I could hear, but and then when he did, is it to catch a thief that has this small woodwinds? It's all very contemporary sounding jazz in the way it's written. And I thought, wow, he could just take one hat off and put another on. And then the genius of, I'm sure you saw that clip of Spielberg and him where he said, "What have you got for me for Jaws?" And he just goes, boom, on the bottom of the piano. You're not even hearing the aggression of the arco basses and he's going, "That's it." And two notes with a third one appearing later on in the mix. But the genius of that was apparently the shark kept breaking down, if you've seen that. And now all of a sudden, the music has another role because they weren't able to shoot everything they wanted. And what I just remember was even without knowing that music, because people were talking about it when the movie came out for us, the music's really, man, and then I'm listening and I go, what is it? There's just two notes. But all of a sudden now you see this couple on the beach and you hear, "Bum, dum," and your immediate reaction is, oh no, they're going to no, don't go, don't swim. Don't. And that's the genius of what he did. I actually crave having that. Netflix are opening down walking distance from my house in a few years. They're putting 12 sound stages here, and I have this fantasy that I'll finally get to score something. Because for years people said your music is so cinematic. It's when so that's one of my bucket list things to do is to have that relationship with a director where can you give me? not take something I've already written and plug it into their movie, which is an honor if they're going to do that. I want to be given a problem to solve or to be part of the story, you know, and I I look at what, obviously Spielberg gave John Williams a whole lot of freedom in decision making. But you hear stories then like Martin Scorsese rejected um, a score from Elmer Bernstein for Gangs of New York. I used to have a copy of the score, but how devastating. That was the last score that Elmer Bernstein wrote and it was rejected. So maybe there's a lot more of that going on in Hollywood than we really know. It's people's work not seeing the light of day. But Williams is definitely, the way he can manipulate a tiny motif is unbelievable to me. It's just, he's just immensely creative man.
You must have been reading my mind because I was just going to comment that Elmer Bernstein is one of my favorite composers for To Kill a Mockingbird. That opening sequence is genius and it sets the tone for the entire movie. And I actually, you can buy, and I did on CD, the entire soundtrack for To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's brilliant to be able to um, set a tone and have that feeling throughout. And there's this sense, kind of like what you're talking about with John Williams. Elmer Bernstein is able to create moments of terror. It's especially in To Kill a Mockingbird, where there are moments throughout the movie where there is violence and such, and foreboding and so. And it really, I find it amazing that this is what music can do: is tell a story without the story.
Yeah. Um, well, I have to say that listening to actors talking passionately about their research of roles opened up, with a song. I think of a song if I've time to do this, I'm going to arrange some like the stuff that I'm going to do for Cassandra coming up. Um, Knowing all this, the fact that she can go into that kind of detail with me, because she does herself. She doesn't just do a song. All her albums have there's something special in the sound. There's something there, and it, I realize now from knowing her for many years that she has she she has ideas about a mood and a vibe, and she plays enough to be able to articulate them. But having somebody that's willing to share the backstory on it, I feel like I'm scoring a short movie, maybe a 3 or 4 minute movie. And when you're scoring a movie, it's not about the music. The music is in support of the storytelling and the mood, and to carry it a step further when it comes to um, when I get to conduct an orchestra, it's usually my own work. It has been other people's work. And I think that's a different level. You're now interpreting somebody else's work, and there's an onus on you. I don't live in that world where I'm not doing it all the time. But what I have found when I've gone to an orchestra with music that I've written, um, if you share with them something like the key that got you in to the mood, it affects how they play everything because they're probably thinking the same way. They're all virtuosic musicians who, you know, on paper it might look like they're holding this long note, and but when you come along and like I'm going to be experimenting with some stuff with strings where different effects that they're going to play to create this a mood underneath a song rather than just long tones. So they'd be improvising with notes to choose from. I did it a little bit on the Delta Blues project, where when you engage them, a lot of people forget that you step in front of an orchestra, they're not children who just got out of college with no experience. They're all playing chamber music as featured soloists or solo recitals. They're top-notch musicians who are parking their own individual interpretation for the greater good. And when you give them a chance to put some of that in, I asked Robert Farnon, actually, the great arranger. Uh, I got to spend a little bit of time with him before he passed. And I asked him about conducting. I said, I saw a video of you conducting, and you just look like you're doing these broad brush strokes, long. And I said, there's all this magic happening in between that I can't see in your hands. And he smiled at me and he said, uh, I must have told him it was maybe a solo passage or something. He said, when I always get to my session early, he said, and as the musicians are arriving, I greet them and say the clarinet player or the oboe player, the principal, as they walk in, I'll walk up and say, the second tune coming up, I wrote a piece specially for you to play, which he would have been thinking of them while he was writing, because he handpicked his musicians. And he very gently just said, they like that you're. And so while he's doing this, they have complete freedom to interpret the way he's just telling them where the beat's going to land. And that was a big lesson. It's like handing off control to these amazing musicians. You're not controlling everything, or if you are, it's your thoughts, and it's you've got a room full of people who can contribute to the conversation. So these things have all impacted me enormously.
It's trusting the process and trusting those who you have around. And trust is not an easy thing, especially in creative processes. And I think that that's a huge lesson to be learned. I just want to finish things out by talking about a really wonderful tribute you wrote after Russell Malone passed. And you talk about um, the beauty of his personality. And I just want to ask you if you could talk a little bit about his influence on you. And I just also want to mention he was teaching at William Patterson University in town before he passed.
So I think most people, when Harry Connick kind of hit the scene first, it was like a young guy singing like Frank Sinatra. That's what people were thinking. And I remember seeing a concert. And they were a young big band, and then there's this guitar player ripping a solo on "It's All Right with Me," I think it was. And so who is that? And it was Russell Malone. And years later, I meet him at a Bucky Pizzarelli gig in Zeno's with was that New York trio they had with John Bunch and
Jay
James
Leonhardt.
Leonard, Jim, and I saw how I think Russell was meeting Bucky for the first time, and I saw how something that would recur years later, his the relationship he had with the elders and his respect for them and how he would reach out to them. Um, and he came and hung out with me. I remember giving him a cassette I had of Ted Green because it was a very hard album to find at the time. Ted Green playing solo. It took me a while to get it back from him, but uh, but Russell's solo guitar work was very inspirational. I used to run into him intermittently and always call me O'Rourke. But I talked to him maybe about a week and a half before he went to Japan, and it was. I was talking to Alina Bloomgarden about this actually, because she said, "Oh, you must have been really close." And I said, I wasn't with him that often. The previous time I'd been with him was, well, he hired me for a studio session writing strings for a singer for an album he was producing. I wrote two arrangements for that. But prior to that, it was hanging out when George Benson came to town. George invited me and Russell to hang and a couple of other people, and we went to Birdland to Vinnie Valentino, um, another great New Jersey jazz guitar player. Vinnie was out that night with us too. Um, but Russell, the fact that I talked to him a week before was because Russell stayed in touch with people. And the previous time I talked to him on the phone, he had called me. Um, so there was something about the way he linked the community. But that day, I know I wrote about this in the tribute because do you know the way people say sometimes when you talk to somebody a week before they died and you go, God, I wish I knew they were, I would have said this, I would have said that, I would have. Um, I don't have that regret here because that day I talked to him about, I'd seen an article and actually he just referenced it the other day. There's a guitar player, I'll name him actually because he won't mind, Taylor Roberts. He lives in Georgia, I think, maybe in Savannah, I'm not sure. And he plays a lot of solo guitar and seven string. He's a Benedetto player. I remember him posting one time that he couldn't play for 3 months, or he was going to have surgery or something, and he said, "I can't believe this. I got a call from my hero." Russell Malone had read on Facebook and called him to give him I suppose, a boost and a pep talk, and he was floored by this. And I just remember thinking, that's really something else, you know. And so here I am, I'm getting calls from him because he connected with the community. So I said to him, I also know how encouraging you are to. I've been teaching, you saw Morel, the young guitar player playing with me. He spoke on the phone to Morel. Morel, I don't think got to meet him in person, but I just thanked him for being that kind of person. And uh, and he said to me, you know, David, I think it was when I was in Jimmy Smith's band, one of the old timers said to me, a candle loses nothing when it lights another candle. And I remember at the time I was out in the garage because I walked out so I could talk undisturbed. And I said, do me a favor, Russ, I'm going back in to get a pen. Will you say that again for me? Because I wanted to make a note of that, not knowing that that would be the last time I talked to him. But I feel so happy that I got to express that to him, my gratitude for the way he embraced the community. You know, he asked about my kids. He was, you know, he was so supportive. So I think we are just talking about this with somebody the other night. It's a very big loss, you know, and we didn't, I knew he'd had health issues, but I thought they were behind him, you know. And then he had an irreverent sense of humor, which everyone has stories that would change the rating of this video. But you know, through him, that same day that I'm talking about, I met Alina Bloomgarden at a wedding I'm playing at, and I'd no idea who Alina was in the pantheon of the jazz world. I thought she was either the rabbi. I'm thinking, do they have female rabbis? Or she's the justice of the peace for this wedding I'm playing at. And she seemed to know all the obscure tunes I was playing as well as the well-known ones. And she asked me if I knew Russell and told me that she ran an organization called Music on the Inside, where Russell and Ron Carter went in and played for prisoners. And I thought never knew that about him. And that he donated the Angelico guitar. Um, and they were going to actually, rather than, they figured they could probably auction that and buy 5 guitars to give to. And she asked, would I give a talk about Russell? And I said, you know, you could probably get 150 people, all jazz guitar players in New York scene, to tell the same story. And she goes, I want you to say that, to share that. And then they changed the date of the gala, and I ended up playing a lot more, and I became very involved. I'm now, you know, Alina and I feel Russell put us together, you know, and so that's what I know. The Pizzarelli family, he meant an awful lot to them for the way he was supportive of Bucky. He used to go and play for him when was he in hospital at the time, I think, or when he was recovering. He'd go in and visit him. Um, and as a result of that, now I'm going to be at the Newport Jazz Festival in a few weeks' time, playing with the um, what they call the Moti Reentry Band, Music on the Inside. and it's people who are formerly incarcerated. And again, I didn't wake up. This is another example of something that's not my idea. I did not wake up saying I'm going to do this. Uh, Suddenly I find myself, the universe has placed me in this, and I feel it's all emanating from, maybe Russell was doing all that kind of thing in the background we didn't know, you know. But he's Alina feels the same thing that I didn't know, by the way, at the time that she was the founder of Jazz at Lincoln Center with Wynton Marsalis, and I'm glad I didn't because I would have been afraid to talk to her. I would have thought she's just going to think I'm looking for a gig, or I didn't know how active you're involved, and we became super close friends. We talk very often, and I feel that's one of the gifts that Russell handed off to me. You know, maybe some people think I'm crazy, but I feel it. It's
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to end our interview with talking about Russell, and it was specifically that quote about a candle loses nothing when it lights another candle. And the reason being is I think you are that candle. I see this in your personality. I've had some wonderful conversations with you and heard you play over several years now. And I see you touching so many lives of younger musicians and older musicians and your respect. And I love the fact that you have your fan moments just like a normal person like me has with other musicians and with you. And, yeah, but I really do think you have a gift that is more than music, that you are sharing your knowledge, you're sharing your goodwill, and you're carrying on that legacy that was shown to you and making sure it's shown to others. And I really do appreciate that.
Oh, thank you, Patty. I appreciate that. I feel I'm doing it on the shoulders of other people, which you could almost create a lineage of going, from you know, besides my family, who are obviously big supporters, but going through the whole Louis Stewart, Bucky Pizzarelli, Pat Martino, George Benson, going into my age peers, like I feel a definite connection to people, in Ireland. Hugh Buckley, guitar player, friend of mine that we came up playing together. His cousin Richie Buckley, tenor sax player, but all the way through, I'm in touch with Stephen Keogh, drummer, who uh, I've yet to have a conversation with him that didn't inspire me in some way or another. He's got that kind of, deep feeling for life and music, cutting all the way through to people like Mark Whitfield, and who I had the pleasure of working with his youngsters in the JSYO, most particularly Davis. But Mark brought his kids to our program. And, Mark's such a great guitar player. Then Dave Stryker, Vic Juris, who left us. But the community of jazz guitar and jazz in general, um, it's hard not to feel, privileged to be embraced in that community yourself. No, because I keep, you mentioned Spielberg and John Williams. I remember a question on Inside the Actors Studio with Steven Spielberg, and he shared sometimes he tries to tell the story of the movie through a character, not necessarily the lead character. And I thought that was very interesting because that's his key in the door, and I um trying to articulate really what I'm trying to say here, that he closed out his conversation by saying, I don't see myself as you do, as you see me, good or bad, he said. And it's the same type of thing. The more and more I play this music, the more I feel that my joy is in the moment creating it. Um, but it's actually going out from us, if that makes sense. So it's for other people, really. But our benefits would be when it feels good in the moment, that's something to be embraced. I don't listen to a lot of my own stuff because for the same reason most people don't, listen to their own works. But when I do, if I hear how great other people sound with me, it helps me to, okay, I must be doing all right. But it's my focus is not on my playing or thing when I'm only being part of the overall picture. And I think that's why collaboration has helped me through the years, writing for people and taking ideas and not being afraid to toss out your own initial idea when you hear that somebody's reaction to it might be, well, how about this? And you have to have that moment where you go, you know what? That does work better. So that's probably as much as I can kind of shed light on in terms of process. But thank you for having me today on this and being able to explore all these topics with you.
Thank you so much for taking the time. It's really been an honor to spend time with you this morning and talk to you and just yeah, have an opportunity to talk about great people and your process and your methods. But also further than that, and this is what I'm getting out of this conversation is there's a lot of emotion and a lot of feeling that you put into your music and your interactions. And that's a very valuable thing.
We missed each other during the pandemic, right? We were all locked away, and I remember thinking during that time that I'll never complain about small talk again. And then Anthony Bourdain passing away I saw how he connected with people. And, I just remember it, and I won't go down a huge rabbit hole on this now, but there was one episode where he was talking about the guy making the broth for ramen noodles in this tiny place in the Far East. And you see the guy in this big vat, and it's days of the time lapse thing and what he's doing just to get the flavor going. And you hear Bourdain's voice saying, "The secrets of the ancestors are contained in this broth." And I was hanging on every word that he's saying. I just thought, it really is. He's not just looking at this guy as being way down the ladder in the chef's ladder of authority. He sees everybody. He sees the dishwashers. And as I read his books, I read about one guy in Daniel, the French restaurant, who filleted fish in the place. I feel like I know this man. And he spoke about him and his family and how he would come in and sit at the chef's table once every 3 or 4 months, and his children would dress up for it. And I just people fascinate me, I guess. And Anthony Bourdain reminded me of that. That good people. You know, bad people don't fascinate me so much.
But you have a real gift to be able to connect with people, and that truly is a pleasure for us. So thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to our paths crossing very soon in the jazz world.
Yes, indeed. Thanks again for having me.